My mom didn't call. She didn't hesitate. She didn't explain. She sent one short text. Please don't come. We just want peace on the big day. I stared at the screen, waiting for the rest. There was nothing. Then my phone buzzed again. My sister reacted to the message with a heart. No words. No apology. Just approval. That's when it hit me. They didn't forget me. They didn't misunderstand me. They erased me. Quietly. Politely. Like I was never part of the story at all. What they didn't know was this. Weeks earlier, I had signed a document tied to that wedding. A document with my name on it. A document that gave me power I didn't even realize I had. I hadn't read the fine print yet. I hadn't understood what I was holding. But once I did, their perfect day would never look the same again. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe to Vengetail Dairy, because stories like this never end the way people expect. My name is Elena Brooks, and I was never the problem child. That's important to say first, because families like mine love to rewrite history later. They like to pretend things happened because someone was difficult, emotional, or reckless. I wasn't any of those things. I was useful. Growing up in Brighton, our house always looked calm from the outside. White walls, trimmed hedges, windows that were always clean enough to reflect the sky. People used words like stable when they talked about us. Teachers smiled when my parents walked into school meetings. Neighbors waved. No one ever suspected anything was off. And technically nothing was. Nothing loud. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point at and say, that's where it went wrong. It was quieter than that. I learned early that I had a role. Not because anyone sat me down and explained it, but because life kept rewarding me when I filled it. If something broke in the house, I fixed it. Or at least tried. A loose drawer. A flickering lamp. A door that didn't close right. I'd kneel on the floor with a screwdriver that was too big for my hands, while my mother, Claire, said things like, "You're so capable, Elena," without ever stopping to help. If someone forgot something, I remembered. Permission slips. Birthdays. Appointments. I reminded my father, Neil, to set alarms. I reminded my mother to send emails. I reminded Lydia to pack her gym kit. If money was tight, I covered it in the only ways a child could. I skipped school trips. I said I didn't need new shoes yet. I learned to say it's fine before anyone asked. No one told me to do these things. But every time I did, the house stayed peaceful. And peace was everything to my mother. Claire loved harmony, the way some people love oxygen. She didn't chase happiness or joy or closeness. She chased quiet, smoothness, the absence of tension. If voices started to rise, she'd step in immediately, smiling too brightly, saying, "Let's not make this a thing." In her mind, conflict was failure. My father avoided conflict too, but differently. Neil didn't smooth things over. He simply stepped back. If a conversation felt uncomfortable, he'd suddenly need to check something in the garage. If emotions ran high, he'd stare at the floor and go silent. He wasn't cruel. He just wasn't present when presence mattered. And then there was my sister, Lydia. Lydia was 2 years younger than me, but she seemed to live in a different world. Where I blended into corners, she drew light. People leaned toward her when she spoke. Teachers laughed at her jokes. Relatives forgave her mistakes before she even apologized. She wasn't mean. That's the hardest part to explain. Lydia didn't wake up each day thinking about how to hurt me. She didn't insult me, or sabotage me, or steal things that were mine. She simply existed in a way that pulled attention toward her, and everyone else adjusted accordingly, including me. If Lydia cried, my mother moved mountains. If I went quiet, it was assumed I was fine. At dinner, Lydia talked. I passed the salt. At school events, Lydia performed. I held coats. At birthdays, Lydia opened gifts. I cleaned wrapping paper off the floor. No one ever said, "Elena, step aside." They didn't have to. I learned to step aside before anyone noticed I was in the way. There were moments. Small ones. So small they almost don't sound worth mentioning. But they added up. When I was 9, I brought home a drawing I was proud of. I waited until my mother finished talking on the phone. I stood there, paper curling in my hands. She glanced at it and said, "That's nice, love," without really looking. Then Lydia ran in, announcing she'd been chosen for a school play. The drawing stayed in my hands until my fingers hurt. When I was 11, I got sick the same week Lydia had a dance recital. My fever wasn't high enough to cancel anything. I stayed home alone while my parents went to watch her perform. My mother left soup on the counter and kissed my head, apologizing softly, like the situation itself was unavoidable. I remember thinking, of course this is how it is. When I was 13, I overheard my mother say to my aunt, "Elena is such an old soul. She doesn't need much." I didn't know then that needing less would become my permanent label. Love, in our house, was conditional in a way no one acknowledged out loud. Be useful. Be easy. Be grateful. The better I was at meeting those conditions, the less attention I required. And the less attention I required, the more peaceful everything felt. So I got very good at disappearing. By the time I reached my teens, responsibility had replaced affection so smoothly that I barely noticed. I packed my own lunches. I walked myself to school. I learned to handle disappointment privately, like a skill you practice until it becomes automatic. If Lydia forgot her homework, teachers smiled indulgently. If I forgot mine, I felt embarrassed, like I'd broken an unspoken contract. I became the one people relied on without realizing it. The one who was always fine. The one who never needed a fuss. The one who didn't make things complicated. And the truth is, for a long time, I didn't resent it. Being needed felt like purpose. It felt safer than being seen. Because if you're useful, people keep you around. If you're quiet, people don't push you away. That logic followed me into adulthood without resistance. I chose a career where organization mattered more than emotion. I learned how to anticipate problems before they formed. I built a life where I was competent, reliable, and low maintenance. My parents praised that version of me. Lydia leaned on it. Friends admired it. No one asked what it cost. And I didn't volunteer the answer. There's a strange loneliness in being the dependable one. It's not dramatic loneliness. It doesn't scream. It hums quietly in the background, like a sound you stop noticing because it's always been there. Sometimes, late at night, I try to remember a moment when someone asked me a simple question. Not can you help? Not can you handle this? Not can you take care of it? But something softer. Something like, what do you want? And that's when the discomfort started creeping in. Because the harder I searched my memory, the emptier it felt. I could list 1,000 things I'd done for other people. But I couldn't remember the last time anyone paused long enough to wonder about me. That realization didn't explode. It settled. Quietly. Heavily. And as I sat with it, another question surfaced. One that refused to leave. If I was this invisible, why was I still giving? And that question followed me straight into the wedding. When Lydia got engaged, no one asked me to help. That part matters. There was no phone call that started with, "Elena, would you mind?" No gentle pause where I could say yes or no. They just assumed. The announcement came over dinner, Lydia glowing, my mother already talking about venues before dessert was cleared. My father smiled and raised a glass. Everyone was buzzing, voices overlapping, plans stacking on top of plans. And somehow, without anyone saying it out loud, the weight slid onto my shoulders. By the next morning, my phone was buzzing. A message from my mother. "Can you look into venues near the coast?" A message from Lydia. "Do you know any good caterers?" An email forwarded to me that I hadn't been copied on originally. "Can Elena handle the logistics?" Handle. Not help. Handle. At first, I didn't question it. This was familiar territory. Organization had always been my quiet contribution to family peace. I told myself it made sense. Lydia was busy. My mother was stressed. My father didn't like details. And I was good at this. So I started doing what I always did. I made lists. I opened spreadsheets. I color-coded deadlines. I compared prices late into the night while the rest of the house slept. I booked venue tours on my lunch breaks. I negotiated catering contracts in between meetings. I paid deposits before anyone asked how they would be covered. The wedding date hovered in my mind like a countdown clock. Every passing day felt louder, closer, heavier. At first, people thanked me. Small thank yous, quick ones. The kind you say while already thinking about the next request. But gratitude fades quickly when usefulness becomes expected. Soon, the thank yous stopped. What replaced them were phrases that sounded harmless but weren't. "You're so organized. You're good at this. You know how to deal with these things." And the one that came up again and again, soft as a compliment, heavy as a command. You always sort things out. Lydia said it the most. Not sharply, not unkindly, almost fondly. She truly believed it. She believed I was stronger than she was, that I could carry more, that I didn't need protection the way she did. In her mind, she wasn't taking from me. She was trusting me. The days blurred together. Emails stacked up. Phone calls overlapped. Problems multiplied like they sensed weakness. The florist changed prices. The venue double-booked a rehearsal slot. The band wanted a higher deposit. Every issue landed in my lap. And every time I fixed one, another appeared. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself once the wedding passed, things would calm down. But weddings don't slow down as they approach. They accelerate. The closer the date crept, the more urgent everything became. I started waking up tired. Not physically at first. Emotionally. The kind of tired that doesn't go away after sleep. My mother called daily, sometimes twice. Elena, can you just check one more thing? Elena, I don't want Lydia stressed. Elena, we need this to be perfect. Perfect. That word followed me everywhere. Perfect meant expensive. Perfect meant flexible. Perfect meant me stepping in before anyone else had to. My father stayed quiet through most of it. When he did speak, it was usually to say, "You're doing a great job," in the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. Encouraging. Distant. Non-committal. Lydia, meanwhile, floated above it all. Dress fittings. Venue walkthroughs. Cake tastings. She showed up for the fun parts. I showed up for everything else. There were moments when I tried to pull back. Small moments. Testing moments. During one meeting, when the catering estimate came in higher than expected, I cleared my throat and said, "Maybe we scale back a bit." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even resistance. It was a suggestion. The room went quiet for half a second. Then Lydia smiled at me. A warm smile. A sisterly smile. "Elena," she said gently, "don't stress. You always sort things out." She meant it as reassurance, as faith, as a reminder of who I was to her. But it landed differently. It landed like a sentence being handed down. A reminder that solving problems was my role, not my choice. Everyone nodded. Conversation moved on. And just like that, the budget issue became mine to absorb. Later that night, alone at my kitchen table, I stared at the numbers on my screen. They didn't scare me. That's what scared me. I had crossed some invisible line where spending thousands of pounds without hesitation felt normal. Expected. Necessary. I noticed other things too. My name wasn't on the invitation drafts. My opinions weren't included unless there was a problem. My presence at meetings was assumed, but my absence was never questioned. I was essential, and somehow invisible at the same time. The wedding plans wrapped around my life like ivy. Slowly at first, then everywhere. I stopped making plans of my own. I postponed trips. I canceled dinners with friends. Every time I tried to step away, something urgent popped up. A crisis that only I could fix. Or so it seemed. The exhaustion didn't hit all at once. It crept in the way my shoulders stayed tense even at rest. In the way silence felt like relief. In the way I started dreading my phone lighting up. Still I kept going. Because stopping felt worse. Stopping meant questions. Stopping meant conflict. Stopping meant disrupting the peace my mother prized so deeply. And I had spent my whole life learning not to do that. It wasn't until one late afternoon, sitting in my car outside a vendor's office, that something shifted. I had just paid another deposit. No discussion. No group decision. Just me. I looked at the receipt in my email. My name at the top. My card charged. My responsibility. And suddenly, a quiet thought surfaced. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just clear. I realized I was financially tied to a celebration I didn't feel part of. A wedding where my presence was optional. My voice was secondary. My role was transactional. I sat there longer than necessary, engine off, hands resting in my lap. The ticking clock wasn't just the wedding date anymore. It was me, counting down. And for the first time, a question formed that made my chest feel tight and electric at the same time. If I was holding everything together, what would happen if I let go? The message came 3 weeks before the wedding. Not during an argument. Not after a disagreement. Not at the peak of stress, when tempers were high. It arrived in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. I remember that part clearly because nothing else about the moment stood out. The sky outside my window was dull and pale, the kind of gray that doesn't threaten rain but doesn't promise light either. My phone was face down on the table while I worked, the soft hum of my laptop filling the room. I wasn't waiting for anything. I wasn't bracing myself. That's how quietly it happened. When the screen lit up, I picked it up without urgency. Just another message. Another question. Another thing to handle. It was from my mother. No greeting. No lead-in. Just one sentence. Please don't come. We just want peace on the big day. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Slower, like maybe the meaning would change if I gave it more attention. It didn't. The room felt suddenly very still. Not tense. Not heavy. Just still. I didn't feel anger rush in. I didn't feel tears press behind my eyes. There was no sharp intake of breath, no dramatic reaction. Instead, something inside me paused. Like a machine that had been running nonstop for years had finally been switched off without warning. I set the phone down on the table. I didn't move. The quiet stretched. Seconds passed. Then more. I became aware of small things I hadn't noticed before. The faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The sound of a car passing outside. The low buzz of electricity in the room. Life continued, untouched by what had just happened. That, more than the message itself, felt unsettling. I picked the phone up again, half expecting the message to disappear. To reveal itself as a misunderstanding. A poorly worded attempt at protecting me from stress. But the words stayed exactly where they were. Please don't come. Not we should talk. Not I'm worried. Not this is hard. Just a request dressed as politeness. I stared at the screen, waiting for something else to arrive. A follow-up. An explanation. A softening. Nothing came. Then, a few seconds later, the screen changed. A small movement. A new notification. Lydia had reacted to the message. A heart. No words. No hesitation. Just approval. That was the moment something shifted permanently. Not because it was cruel, but because it was easy. It was so casual. So quick. So effortless. A tiny gesture that carried more weight than 1,000 arguments ever could. She didn't call me. She didn't ask how I felt. She didn't explain. She liked the message. As if my absence was a solution. As if removing me from the picture simplified everything. I noticed my hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. I'd always assumed a moment like this would feel dramatic. That my chest would tighten. That my pulse would race. That emotion would surge in some recognizable way. Instead, there was nothing. No heat. No cold. Just a strange emptiness where something familiar used to be. I wasn't hurt. I was erased. That distinction mattered. Being hurt implies you still occupy space. That someone saw you and struck you anyway. This felt different. This felt like being quietly removed from the room while everyone else kept talking. I didn't sit there thinking about how unfair it was. I didn't replay old arguments or list past sacrifices. Those thoughts didn't come yet. What came instead was a realization, so calm it scared me. They didn't forget me. They didn't overlook me. They chose peace over my presence. And in their minds, that choice was reasonable. I typed a response without thinking too much about it. 2 words. Understood. Not because I understood, but because explaining myself suddenly felt pointless. I didn't add an emoji. I didn't soften it. I didn't ask for clarification. I sent it and placed the phone face down again. The silence returned. This time, it felt heavier. Not oppressive. Final. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, watching a shadow move slowly across it as the afternoon light shifted. Time passed, but it felt suspended, like the world had paused out of respect for something unnamed. It was strange how quickly my body adjusted. No urge to call anyone. No desire to vent. No instinct to fix it. Fixing had always been my reflex. This time, the reflex was gone. I realized then that something inside me had shut down, so cleanly it didn't even announce itself. The part of me that rushed forward. The part that smoothed things over. The part that made sure everyone else was comfortable. It simply stopped. I stood up eventually, moved through my flat without purpose. I poured a glass of water and forgot to drink it. I straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. I checked my phone again, knowing nothing new would be there. The group chat was quiet. No one followed up. No one checked in. The absence of noise became its own answer. As evening settled in, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. Not because I had a plan. Not because I wanted revenge. I just needed something solid in front of me. Something factual. Something that wasn't shaped by emotion. The screen glowed softly in the dimming room. I logged in and pulled up the folder I'd been using for wedding planning. Dozens of files appeared instantly. Contracts, schedules, invoices, documents I knew intimately but had never really looked at. I didn't open anything yet. I just stared at the list. It struck me how much of my life was sitting there, neatly labeled. How much effort, time, and money had been funneled into this event. An event I had just been uninvited from. That thought didn't hurt the way it should have. It felt clarifying. I noticed a file I didn't recognize immediately. A document with my name attached to it. I frowned slightly, trying to remember when I'd last opened it. The memory didn't come. I leaned closer to the screen, eyes scanning the file name again. Something about it tugged at my attention. I felt a shift then. Not emotional. Not reactive. Awareness. Like standing at the edge of something and realizing the ground beneath you isn't as solid as you thought. I didn't click on it yet. I just sat there, hands resting on the keyboard, the quiet of the room pressing in. The message from my mother was still there, unread now, pushed down the screen by time but not erased. But for the first time since it arrived, it no longer felt like the most important thing in the room. There was something else on that screen. Something heavier. Something that had nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with facts. I didn't know what it meant yet. I didn't know what it could change. But I knew, with a calm certainty that made my stomach tighten, that whatever I was about to see mattered more than the text that had just erased me. And that thought followed me into the silence, unanswered. What was waiting inside that document? Here's what you know now. Before I did, before I understood what any of it meant, every contract connected to that wedding was signed under my consulting company. Not Lydia's name. Not my mother's. Not even my father's. Mine. You already see where this is going. I didn't. Not yet. Months earlier, when the planning first started spiraling, Lydia had pulled me aside one evening. She was overwhelmed, eyes glassy, voice unsteady. She said she trusted me. She said I was good at this kind of thing. She said she just wanted the stress to stop. Can you just handle it professionally? She asked. That word mattered. Professionally. At the time, it sounded harmless. Sensible even. I had a small consulting business on the side, the kind that dealt with logistics, planning, coordination. Vendors took me seriously when I spoke for it. Things moved faster. Problems dissolved more easily. It felt practical. So I did what I always did. I stepped in. When vendors asked who they should send contracts to, I gave them my work email. When deposits were required, I used my business account. When signatures were needed, I signed them the way I always signed things. Carefully, clearly, without hesitation. There was no secrecy, no deception, no moment where I thought, this gives me control. Because I wasn't thinking about control. I was thinking about efficiency. I was thinking about keeping things smooth, keeping Lydia calm, keeping my mother reassured. I was thinking about peace. And peace, in my family, had always come from me absorbing responsibility quietly. That's how trust turns into power without anyone noticing. If you're listening to this right now, you probably already feel the shift. You can see the implications forming long before I did. That's intentional. Because from the outside, it's obvious. From the inside, it never is. I had always treated my name on those documents as a technicality, a formality, something that made the process easier, not something that meant anything. But legality doesn't care about intention. Legality only cares about names. And my name was everywhere. Every vendor agreement. Every payment authorization. Every cancellation clause. All tied back to my company. Which meant something simple and terrifying. If the wedding moved forward, it did so because I allowed it. If it stopped because I said so. The wedding wasn't just planned by me. It belonged to me. I want to be clear about something. I didn't realize this in a dramatic flash. There was no sudden gasp, no pounding heart, no rush of adrenaline. This understanding crept in slowly, like dawn light slipping through a crack you didn't know was there. At first, it was just a detail. Then it became a pattern. Then it became undeniable. I scrolled through documents I had signed without a second thought. I read clauses I had skimmed months earlier. I noticed language that assigned authority, responsibility, and decision-making power to the party listed at the top. Me. It felt strange to sit there knowing this, while the rest of my family carried on as if nothing had changed. As if I was still just the background support. The helper. The extra set of hands. They didn't know the structure beneath the surface had shifted. And neither did I, not fully. What unsettled me most wasn't the power itself. It was how easily it had come to me. No fight. No argument. No demand. Just trust. Lydia trusted me because she believed I was stronger. That I didn't need guarding. That I could handle pressure without breaking. My mother trusted me because I had never let things fall apart before. Because I had always stepped in before conflict could bloom. My father trusted me because I was reliable, and reliability meant he didn't have to engage. None of them saw this as giving me control. They saw it as leaning on someone who had never pushed back. And I had accepted that role so completely that I didn't question it. So here's the question I started circling, slowly, carefully, like it might bite if I moved too fast. If you didn't mean to gain power, do you still deserve to use it? It wasn't a loud question. It didn't accuse. It hovered, because power gained through manipulation feels wrong. Easy to condemn. Easy to reject. But power gained through trust? That's harder. Especially when the trust was real. Especially when no one intended harm. I sat with that discomfort longer than I expected to. I thought about Lydia. About how she genuinely believed I didn't need protection. How she assumed I was capable of absorbing things she couldn't. In her mind, she wasn't exploiting me. She was relying on me. I thought about my mother, whose fear of conflict had shaped every decision she ever made. How excluding me felt like a reasonable sacrifice to preserve calm. And I thought about myself, about how I had never once said no, never drawn a line, never asked to be seen differently. Power doesn't always arrive as a weapon. Sometimes it arrives as a mirror. And what I saw reflected back wasn't anger. It was responsibility. Heavy. Complicated. Undeniable. I could have acted then. That's the part people expect. They expect the moment of revelation to trigger immediate action. Swift consequences. A dramatic pivot. But I didn't move. I closed the document. Not because I was afraid. Not because I lacked courage. But because I needed to understand what I was holding before deciding what to do with it. Using power without clarity felt just as dangerous as being powerless. I didn't want to become the thing I resented. I wanted to know where the line was, and whether crossing it would make me just another person who justified harm by calling it necessary. So I waited. I let the knowledge settle. I let the silence stretch. The wedding clock kept ticking. My family carried on, unaware that the foundation beneath their plans rested on my quiet consent. And I made a choice that surprised even me. Not to act. Not yet. Because if I didn't use this power now, the real question wasn't whether I could. It was when I would decide that using it was no longer optional. And that question stayed with me, unanswered, as the days moved closer to the wedding. If I don't use it now, when will I? People like their villains simple. They want someone loud, cruel, unmistakably wrong. Someone whose actions are easy to condemn, whose motives are easy to reject. It makes the story cleaner that way. Safer. But my mother was never that kind of villain. My mother, Claire, wasn't driven by hatred. She was driven by fear. And fear, when it wears the mask of reason, is much harder to fight. Claire grew up believing that families survive by staying calm. That raised voices crack foundations. That once harmony breaks, it never truly returns. Her own childhood had taught her that peace was fragile, something you guarded fiercely or lost forever. So she built her life around preserving it. She married a man who avoided conflict as much as she did. She raised her children to fit into a system where discomfort was smoothed over quickly, where tension was treated like a threat instead of a signal. From the outside, it looked admirable. Inside, it meant someone always paid the cost. That someone was me. I remember the first time she said it. We were standing in the kitchen, years ago, late evening. The house was quiet. Lydia had just gone to her room after crying about something small that felt enormous to her. A friend issue. A disappointment. I don't even remember the details anymore. I remember my mother's voice, though. She just needs so much, Claire said, rubbing her temples. Everything feels bigger to her. I nodded, the way I always did. Then she looked at me and smiled, not unkindly. Elena, she said, you're strong enough without the spotlight. At the time, it sounded like praise, like reassurance, like a compliment. I didn't realize it was a sentence. Over the years, that belief hardened into a rule she lived by. Lydia was sensitive. Lydia was emotional. Lydia needed protection. And me, I was capable, resilient, reliable. In my mother's mind, that meant I didn't need as much. Not because she loved me less, but because she believed I could survive more. That logic shaped everything. When Lydia cried, my mother rushed in. When I went quiet, she assumed I was processing. When Lydia struggled, adjustments were made. When I struggled, it was framed as growth. Claire didn't see herself as choosing one daughter over the other. She saw herself as allocating resources efficiently. And that's what made her dangerous. Because efficiency doesn't care about fairness. It cares about outcomes. If sacrificing one person's comfort kept the household stable, she believed it was worth it. If asking me to step back preserved peace, she saw it as practical, not cruel. She genuinely believed she was protecting the family. And the hardest truth was this. I understood her. I understood the exhaustion in her eyes when tension rose. I understood her panic at the thought of a wedding overshadowed by conflict. I understood why removing me from the equation felt like the easiest solution. I had been the buffer for so long that she forgot buffers feel impact too. Or maybe she never allowed herself to think about it. Understanding her didn't bring me relief. It brought danger. Because the moment you understand someone's harm, it becomes tempting to excuse it. I started replaying conversations from the past with new clarity. The time she'd say, "Let's not upset Lydia right now." The time she'd ask me to compromise, just this once. The way she framed my sacrifices as choices instead of expectations. She wasn't lying. She was rationalizing. And rationalization is far more persuasive than cruelty. I thought about the wedding again, this time through her eyes. A single day meant to be perfect. A fragile moment loaded with expectation. A daughter who thrived on affirmation. And me, the steady one. The one who would understand. The one who always did. From Claire's perspective, asking me not to attend wasn't punishment. It was preventative care. A way to ensure nothing disrupted the illusion she had worked her entire life to maintain. And if I was honest with myself, I could see how easily I might have made the same choice if I believed peace depended on it. That's what unsettled me. Not that my mother had wronged me, but that her reasoning almost made sense. I sat with that realization longer than I wanted to. Because once you start seeing the logic behind harm, the ground beneath you shifts. Right and wrong blur. Lines soften. And suddenly, the question isn't just about what was done to you. It's about what you're capable of doing in return. I had power now. Real power. Not emotional leverage. Not moral high ground. Legal authority. And my mother's logic whispered at the edges of my thoughts. If peace justifies sacrifice, if outcomes matter more than intent, if harm can be reframed as necessity, then what would that make me if I used the power I had? I told myself I was different, that I wouldn't act out of fear, that I wouldn't justify harm by calling it practical. But understanding has a way of loosening convictions, because empathy, when unchecked, can turn into permission. I thought about Lydia again, about how she wasn't cruel, just sheltered, just accustomed to being protected, about how my mother had built a world where Lydia never had to grow stronger because someone else always absorbed the weight. Was it fair to disrupt that now? Was it kind? Or was kindness just another word for avoidance? The questions tangled together until I couldn't tell where compassion ended and self-betrayal began. And that's where the moral line blurred completely. I wasn't standing on one side of it anymore. I was hovering above it, unsure which way falling would mean I'd lost myself. Understanding my mother didn't absolve her, but it complicated everything. Because if fear could justify her choices, what could justify mine? I sat with that thought in the quiet, letting it press against me without resistance. And a final question formed, slow and heavy, settling into the silence like something that refused to be ignored. Does understanding excuse harm? I didn't answer it. Not yet. But as the wedding drew closer and the power I held remained unused, another question began to rise beneath it, sharp and dangerous. If I understood her so well, was I about to cross a line too? The night was quiet in a way that made you notice every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows. I walked slowly, the soles of my shoes dragging against the pavement, towards Mrs. Hargreaves' small, crooked house at the end of Maple Lane. I hadn't been back in years, not since I was a child, but her address had stayed lodged in my mind like a tiny, persistent note I couldn't erase. Most people had forgotten Mrs. Hargreaves. They walked past her in the streets and didn't see the thin woman hunched over in the doorway, her hair a cloud of silver and her eyes clouded, too, with the fog of dementia. She had once been a fixture in the neighborhood, her presence commanding even if she spoke softly. People had moved on. She hadn't. I had remembered. I knocked on the door. It took a while for her to recognize me, her gaze darting around the room as though she were searching for someone she could not quite place. "Ah, yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You've come to play again." I smiled faintly. "Not today, Mrs. Hargreaves." She didn't seem disappointed. Instead, she hobbled over to the radiator, shivering slightly. "It's so cold tonight." I set down my bag. "I can fix that," I said. The radiator hadn't been working for months. I kneaded the valves, twisted the knobs, fiddled with the pipes. The old metal groaned, then slowly, a faint warmth began to spread across the room. "You always did like to tinker with things," she murmured. She had said it dozens of times before, when I had been a boy fumbling over piano strings and damp keys, my fingers too clumsy to make the notes sing. I made her tea, black, just the way she liked it. I poured it slowly, over-steaming, spilling a little onto the saucer. She didn't mind. She never did. We sat together in silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full of all the words you've held back, all the confessions that don't need to be spoken. I watched her hands, fragile and veined like tree branches, curl around the teacup. She sipped slowly, her gaze drifting to the cracked window, as though she could see through time itself. "You remind me of someone," she said softly, and for a moment I thought she might drift off into a memory, lost like a boat at sea. Someone who gives until there's nothing left. The words sank into me like stones in a pond. I hadn't expected that. I hadn't expected anyone to notice, or to care, or to see what I had become through the quiet erosion of years. It wasn't my family. They had grown accustomed to taking what I gave without looking. It wasn't my friends. Most of them had stopped calling. It wasn't the world. The world had moved on indifferent. But those few words from her, spoken without judgment or demand, shattered me more completely than anything else ever could. I felt the hollowness open inside me, a slow and patient unspooling of everything I had built, every effort, every kindness, every attempt to keep people afloat while forgetting to keep myself afloat. I felt empty, not angry, not bitter, just hollow. I wanted to cry, but didn't. I simply sat there, feeling the warmth of the radiator seep into my legs, the teacup heavy and warm in my hands, the quiet pressing against me. My own thoughts sounded loud in the room. I remembered all the people I had tried to help and the ones I had lost. Not lost as in gone, they were still alive, but lost to me because the world had moved on. There was the old man who lived next door and hadn't spoken to anyone for 10 years. I had helped him carry groceries once and never returned. There was the woman at the grocery store, her cart always too full, her face always tired. I had smiled at her, made small talk, and forgotten her name by the next week. The world forgets. It moves on. And in that forgetting, it leaves fragments behind, quiet souls like Mrs. Hargreaves, like the man who would stand on the corner humming old tunes that no one remembered, like me, carrying the memory of everyone else's absence and pretending it was mine to bear. She looked at me again, her eyes briefly clear. "You know," she said, and this time her voice held a sharpness that cut through the fog. "You think you're giving saves people, but sometimes it just teaches them to forget you." I couldn't speak. The words lodged in my chest. They weren't cruel, they weren't meant to be, but the truth in them hit harder than any judgment I had faced. I realized in that instant how quietly, how thoroughly I had emptied myself for everyone else, and how silently, almost without noticing, the world had emptied me right back. Her gaze softened, and she reached out, taking my hand in hers. Her fingers were cool and thin, trembling slightly. "Don't stop," she said. "Just remember that you matter too, even if no one else remembers." It wasn't advice. It wasn't a lesson. It was a quiet revelation delivered in the gentlest of ways. I felt my chest tighten, my throat burn, and I understood, finally, the quiet, almost invisible debt I had been living under, the one I owed to myself, to the part of me that no longer had the energy to give away without pause. I left her house with a strange mixture of weight and lightness. My steps were slower on the pavement. The night had grown colder, darker. Streetlights flickered, throwing thin halos on the sidewalks. Somewhere, a cat meowed and then disappeared. I felt smaller, yes, diminished, but also, strangely, more awake than I had been in months. When I got home, I collapsed in the chair at the kitchen table. There was a quiet in the apartment, too, empty and patient. I could hear my own breathing. My hands felt like strangers. And then I noticed the envelope, sitting on the counter like a small, silent sentinel. I hadn't looked at it before. I hadn't dared. Months had passed since it arrived, and yet I had left it untouched, almost hoping it would dissolve into the ether if ignored long enough. But now, in the aftermath of what Mrs. Hargreaves had made me feel, it called to me differently. Not with urgency, not with threat, but with truth. I picked it up. The paper felt thick, crisp, final. I turned it over in my hands. And then, finally, I opened it. And that was the moment everything shifted. Because nothing in that room, nothing in that night, could have prepared me for what I was about to read. Because in that document, in the carefully typed lines, were the things I had buried, the realities I had ignored, the choices I had made, and the consequences I had been avoiding. And yet, for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the world had finally spoken back to me, not with judgment, but with honesty. I sat there, still holding the envelope, and I realized that Mrs. Hargreaves' words weren't just about her. They weren't even just about me. They were about the invisible, quiet truth that exists in all of us, that giving until there is nothing left is both a gift and a theft, that kindness doesn't always require heroism, and that sometimes the simplest statement from someone the world has forgotten can shatter you more than a lifetime of drama. And I wondered, as I traced the edges of the paper with trembling fingers, what she had realized about me that night. What had she seen? What had she understood about the hollowness I carried, and the quiet, stubborn resilience that had allowed me to keep moving forward despite it? I didn't know, but I would soon, because I had opened the document, and whatever came next, there would be no turning back. I didn't cancel the wedding. That might have been the easy path, the path people would expect, the path everyone, including my family, was waiting for me to take. I could have pulled the plug. I could have humiliated them. I could have made them feel every ounce of the frustration, betrayal, and resentment they had caused me. I had thought about it, every cruel permutation, every imagined moment of shock, every whispered conversation behind my back, every look of disbelief as the news spread. But I didn't. Instead, I transferred it. Quietly, deliberately, intentionally. It wasn't impulsive or dramatic. There were no emails sent in anger, no calls in the middle of the night, no brash confrontations. I simply moved the date, the venue, the staff, and the catering, all of it, to a purpose that could change lives rather than destroy egos. The same people, same contracts, same expenses, but the event would no longer be about the celebration of a family's vanity or the satisfaction of societal expectation. It would be about something real, something urgent, something the world had mostly ignored. The new purpose came naturally, almost by accident. The charity had been on my mind for months, a foundation supporting elderly abuse survivors, people who had been overlooked, dismissed, forgotten, people whose struggles had been brushed aside as inconveniences, people like Mrs. Hargreaves, like the quiet, unnoticed souls I had met along the way. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had been expected to bring shame and chaos, to revel in destruction. And instead, I gave power to kindness. I paid the vendors in full. No complaints, no negotiation, no reminders of past grudges. They didn't know the real story, and they didn't need to. Contracts were contracts, and the money changed hands without hesitation. Legal, precise, unassailable. I even sent Lydia a message. Short, calm, unemotional. You're free from my involvement. I hope your day is beautiful. She didn't reply immediately. She assumed I had folded. She assumed I had surrendered. She assumed that the story she had rehearsed in her mind, the one where I exploded, humiliated her, and upended everything, was coming true. She thought I had retreated. The day arrived, and I waited quietly for the inevitable, for the gasps, for the murmurs, for the judgment. I braced myself for the moment the family would finally realize that the person they had underestimated had been capable of taking down the entire event. The venue filled as expected. Guests arrived in formal wear, some in champagne-colored gowns, others in tailored black suits. Waitstaff moved through the lobby with trays of sparkling water and small plates of canapes, all prepared as if for a wedding. But something was off. There were banners. Tall, elegant banners that read, in bold letters, "You are not disposable." The first guest who noticed it paused, and then another and another. Eyes widened. Fingers pointed. Whispers began to spread through the room like fire in dry grass. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Others paused, confused. A few stared at the entrance, trying to reconcile the glittering chandeliers and the elegant linens with the message that had appeared overnight. The charity representatives moved through the crowd. They had tables set up with literature, photographs, and personal stories of the people they supported. There were volunteers stationed discreetly at the doors, quietly greeting guests and handing out programs. People began to realize what had happened. The wedding they had expected, the family's performance, the centerpieces, the speeches, the celebration of status was gone. In its place was something quieter, something bigger than anyone could have anticipated, something undeniably good. I watched the first few guests' faces, holding my calm, absorbing the shock without celebrating it. The tension in the room built gradually, like a tide creeping over sand. People were beginning to grasp that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. One by one, guests started moving through the space. Their footsteps softened as they read the stories of the charity's work. They lingered by photographs of elderly survivors, faces lined with hardship, eyes bright with courage. They saw letters, testimonials, and small notes that told them what it meant to be recognized, to be valued, to matter. By the time the formal dinner began, the room had transformed completely. Conversations shifted from idle gossip to thoughtful engagement. People were donating quietly, often in secret, sliding checks across tables and whispering thank yous to volunteers. There was laughter, yes, but it wasn't shallow or superficial. It was the kind of laughter that comes when hearts are moved, when empathy replaces expectation. I watched it all unfold from a distance, careful not to draw attention to myself. The family didn't notice me. Not yet. I allowed the shock to simmer, to stretch, to grow. Their confusion had become a kind of silent theater, performed without words, their faces frozen between disbelief and suspicion. I let them stew in it for a while longer. The parents, so certain I would retaliate. My sister, so sure I had folded. They had been waiting for an outburst, a disaster, a spectacle. Instead, there was quiet. There was calm. There was power, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that uplifts, that reshapes, that changes the story without raising a voice. The charity raised more money in one night than Lydia's wedding ever could have. The donors, some of whom had never contributed to anything before, were moved in a way I hadn't expected even myself. The old, forgotten souls whose struggles had been invisible for so long now had a night devoted entirely to them. And the family? They were beginning to realize that the narrative they had expected, of chaos, revenge, humiliation, was not coming. They assumed, in that moment, that I had given up, that I had retreated, that I had let them win. And in a sense, they were right. I had given up the revenge they anticipated. But what they didn't know, what they would never see coming, was that in that surrender there was an unspoken triumph. A quiet, deliberate assertion of agency, purpose, and truth. They were waiting for destruction, and I gave them better. By the end of the night, the banners had become a statement, repeated in conversation, and whispered across tables. Volunteers smiled, exhausted but satisfied, carrying boxes of donations to waiting vehicles. The guests, dressed in their formal wear, had walked into a wedding and emerged witnesses to a transformation. They had seen the power of intentional kindness, and some of them would remember it for the rest of their lives. And still, the family lingered in their disbelief. They had arrived expecting spectacle. They had left witnessing something intangible, something beyond their comprehension. Their expectations of anger, revenge, and chaos had been replaced with nothing. Only quiet, only impact, only truth. I could imagine their thoughts. She folded. She didn't retaliate. She let it go. She gave up. They were wrong. Because the heroism of this moment wasn't in destruction. It wasn't in confrontation or in public humiliation. It was in the careful orchestration of consequence without cruelty, in the intentional redirection of resources, in the kind of power that doesn't roar but flows, steady and persistent, until it changes the world around it. And in that quiet, unassuming power, I found a release I had never expected. A satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with clarity. A realization that sometimes the most radical act of defiance isn't to destroy, but to create, to lift, to redirect the energy of others towards something meaningful. The night ended, as all nights do, with guests departing. They carried with them more than just the memory of the event. They carried hope. And the family, still standing in stunned silence near the doorway, carried only questions. What happens when they find out? What happens when they realize that I had orchestrated the entire transformation from behind the scenes? That their expectation of spectacle had been replaced with something infinitely more effective? That I had paid the vendors, reassigned the venue, and created a night that would resonate far beyond the walls of a single hall? They didn't know yet, and the realization would be theirs alone, delayed, slow, and unavoidable. And in that waiting, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. The quiet satisfaction of someone who had taken control, not through fury, but through intention. The kind of power that doesn't need applause, the kind that doesn't need recognition, the kind that simply is, and changes everything anyway. The phone rang before dawn. I answered it, still bleary-eyed, and my mother's voice came through in pieces, shouts, then sobs, then accusations tangled together like a storm. She did what? Do you realize what you've done? I can't believe this. How could you? It wasn't a single coherent sentence. It was fragments of anger and fear and disbelief smashed together. My mother had expected a disaster. She had expected me to lash out, to humiliate, to destroy, to prove the point that I was always the one who could be counted on to cause chaos. She had not expected this. I listened, silent. I didn't defend myself. I didn't apologize. I didn't try to explain. Words would not have fixed what she didn't yet understand. Lydia called next. Her tears were quieter, but no less intense. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Her voice cracked halfway through, and I realized that for the first time in years, she was grappling with something bigger than herself. Something she hadn't anticipated. She transferred everything. She asked finally, almost in disbelief. The whole wedding. To charity. Yes, I said softly. Her silence followed, long and uneven. I could imagine the mix of confusion, resentment, and awe struggling to find words. Her scripted expectation of anger and revenge had been interrupted, replaced by something she couldn't categorize. She had been trained to expect a performance, and I had refused to deliver. Then my father. He didn't call. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He stayed silent, which somehow felt louder than either of the other two combined. Hours later, I got a single text, "We need to talk." I set the phone down. The tension had not disappeared. It had only shifted. Reactions, it seemed, could be messy, human, unpredictable. They could not be orchestrated or controlled, and I had no desire to try, because by the time the dust settled, something else happened, something I hadn't expected. A man appeared at my door. Not a lawyer, not a journalist, not someone from the family trying to persuade me back into the narrative I had refused to play. Just a man with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor. He introduced himself as Matthew Hargreaves, Mrs. Hargreaves' son. He hesitated, searching for words. I just wanted to say thank you, For my mom. For the way you helped her. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't about status, or money, or victory. It was a small, quiet acknowledgement of a life changed, a life preserved, a life remembered. You saved her, he said simply, when we didn't know how. I felt something shift inside me, a release I hadn't expected. This was not the triumph I had imagined in my daydreams of revenge. This was a quieter, deeper, more human form of validation. It didn't roar. It didn't demand attention. But it healed. It healed a hollow place in me that anger and retaliation never could. For years, I had thought that my power was measured by the weight of the chaos I could create, that my victories would only matter if they humiliated those who had wronged me. And yet here was proof that the most meaningful impact could come not from destruction, but from intentionality, from focus, from choosing where to direct my energy. It was a different kind of power. I walked Matthew through the details, not with pride, but with calm. I explained how I had quietly reassigned the vendors, paid the bills, transformed the venue, and guided the event without a single person outside the charity knowing what had happened. He listened, nodding, eyes wide in amazement, but there was no jealousy, no envy, no sense of spectacle. Just gratitude, a pure, human response. And in that gratitude, I found something else entirely. The understanding that my presence, my effort, my insistence on being intentional had mattered to someone who had been almost entirely forgotten by the world. That mattered more than any imagined humiliation I could have inflicted on my family. The fallout from my family was slow. Calls and messages trickled in over the next week. There were attempts at confrontation, questions about contracts, about etiquette, about whether I had gone too far. But the anger was muted. Confusion replaced rage. Their scripts had been disrupted. The chaos they had expected never came. They were left with nothing but the truth. I had acted deliberately, legally, quietly, and they had been powerless to stop it. And yet the real reward was not in their reaction. The real reward was in knowing I had stopped disappearing for them. I had spent so many years erasing myself, bending to their expectations, giving until there was nothing left. I had been invisible in the ways that mattered most. And now, finally, I had taken back ownership of my time, my energy, my intention. I had chosen where my strength went, and it had not gone to punishment. It had gone to care, to impact, to humanity. There were no speeches. There were no announcements. There was no curtain call. I did not demand recognition or thanks. I simply watched, quietly, as the lives around me, especially the quiet ones, were touched. And I understood that this was enough. That this was the point. That this, in its subtlety, was far more enduring than any act of revenge could ever be. I spent the evening reflecting. The charities team called to thank me, but the thanks felt secondary. The true acknowledgement had already come, quietly, in Matthew's words, in the moments where someone felt seen, safe, and valued. I realized then that the satisfaction of revenge is often fleeting, loud, and hollow. The satisfaction of intention, of choosing where your energy goes, of standing up for yourself without hurting others, it lasts. It resonates. It lingers. I looked back on the last few months, the contracts, the planning, the quiet orchestration of a transformed event, and saw clearly how different my motivations had been. The day I transferred the wedding had not been about retaliation. It had been about reclaiming myself, about refusing to vanish for the convenience of others, about asserting, without shouting, that my choices, my kindness, and my focus mattered. And in that assertion I felt free. Free from expectation, free from anger, free from the endless cycle of giving until there was nothing left, then feeling resentment for what remained unseen. Free to choose my strength, instead of letting it be dictated by someone else's narrative. The family still hasn't fully processed it. They speak in fragments when they speak at all. They assume I gave up, that I folded, that I allowed them to have the last word. But the reality is quietly different. I didn't give up. I redirected. I reclaimed. I stopped disappearing. And in doing so, I found a power that is quieter, gentler, but infinitely more resilient than any act of revenge could ever be. It is a strange kind of victory, one that makes you question the nature of strength itself. For years, I had equated power with the ability to wound. Now I understand that power can be measured in the courage to focus, to redirect, to care where it counts, and to protect the self without sacrificing the good. Revenge feels powerful, yes. It tempts you with immediate gratification and dramatic satisfaction. But choosing where your strength goes, that is freedom. And that freedom is something no one else can take from you, not even the people who expected your collapse. As the night drew to a close, I thought of Mrs. Hargreaves, of her gentle smile, of her quiet words. I thought of the people at the charity, their lives touched not by anger or punishment, but by deliberate intention and kindness. I thought of Matthew, who had found me not to confront, not to accuse, but to offer thanks for something I hadn't even realized I had achieved. The reward had been subtle. It had been human. It had been real. And in that quiet, I felt my place in the world shift just slightly, enough to know that I no longer had to disappear, enough to know that my energy, my time, and my effort could be mine to choose. Enough to understand that revenge, though loud and tempting, is often misdirected strength. I didn't win by hurting others. I won by refusing to erase myself. And maybe, in the silence left behind, that is a victory that lasts. If you followed this story to the end, take a moment to think about your own boundaries, your own choices, and where your energy truly matters. Sometimes the most radical, powerful act isn't destruction, it's intentionality. If you've been moved by this story, consider engaging with us. Like, comment, and subscribe to Vengetail Diary for more stories that explore the unexpected power of quiet choices and human resilience. Your support helps bring these real, emotional journeys to life, and your voice adds to the conversation about strength, boundaries, and the real meaning of freedom.